All right, we're back. You're listening to The Black Tower Show. I'm your host, Nathan Ford. We're broadcasting 1310 WRSB, 1590 WASB, Rochester, Canandaigua, Brockport, upstate New York, here in BC Studios with Jake Fox sitting right next to me in the studio. And it's cool out there. It's fall is in the air. The pumpkin spice. Everything's pumpkin spice now. You can't go anywhere without the pumpkin spice hitting you. We got work to do here in BC Studios. Our guest again in the Black Tower Show. It's an honor to have him. Distinguished guest Joel Skousen, political scientist by training, specializing in the philosophy of law and constitutional theory, and is also designer of high-security residences and retreats. He has designed self-sufficient and high-security homes throughout North America and has consulted in Central America as well. His latest book in this field is called Strategic Relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places. He also writes for the World Affairs Brief. You can go to World Affairs Brief, and it's a kind of a news conglomerate. He has news there. You can go, and I like his style because he's talking about how to interpret the news, which is what you have to do nowadays. You have to find a way to kind of get at the truth. And Joel Skousen helps you get there. Go to the worldaffairsbrief.com. Joel Skousen, our guest on the Black Tower Show. Thank you, sir, for being on the show.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
If you go to the World Affairs Brief, you're going to see updated news articles that you post up there, and I find it interesting. And I do want to start with what happened. This shooting, and now they're saying that there was 2 other potential suspects here. Of course, we're talking about the Navy Yard shooting that happened. This is just more of the same, it seems to us, where the initial news story comes out, you hear of 2 or 3 shooters, and then all of a sudden it becomes this very clean thing. There was one shooter, and now he's dead, and everybody just go about your business. Is this just more of the same? Are we being deceived here, Mr. Joel Skousen?
Well, I think there is a major deception here, and it's like every one of the other program shooters that always have a history of mental instability. There's always a second person or third person involved to make sure that they either get taken down or commit suicide. We've had this happen in the Scottish shooting, which led to gun control in the UK, where the person was supposedly committed suicide, but the bullet in his head was the wrong caliber from the gun that was next to his hand, indicating that there's someone else who shot him. In the Autumn Lanza fiasco there at the Newtown massacre, there was another person in handcuffs, according to at least one witness, that the police took away, and yet they claimed that there was only Adam Lanza.
Yeah.
And of course, they falsified and changed the numbers of weapons. There's everything about the Navy Yard shooter smacks of something very, very wrong, claiming that this guy got a secret clearance renewed in July when he obviously had a police blotter that was would have caught. I mean, at a minimum, even if they claim that this was simply a temporary clearance, which there is no indication it was temporary, nevertheless, they would have brought up a police record had they even done the most minimal check. Now, the police background check, of course, comes through the federal government. It was not done by the contractor, quote, the experts, the name of the contractor working under HP that he was viewed as. And so this was clearly something that was cleared at the federal level. It looks to me like there was... this guy had a mental background. He probably was on mood-altering drugs, which allows for the programming or hypnotism of the mind to be more easily done. I mean, normal people, even criminals, don't do this kind of blatant shooting.
Sure.
He only had registered to him, or at least purchased recently, a shotgun. An 870 Remington, of course, is a multi-shot, but there's no indication that anybody was shot with the shotgun. He was shooting with an AR-15. Where did he get that AR-15? Sure. None of the guards in that area were carrying AR-15s. The one guard that was supposedly securing people in the area was unarmed. Now, there did, of course, respond to, once the shooting started, armed guards who were taken down, as well as, SWAT teams eventually. But the big question is, how do you get into there? It's one thing to have an ID badge, but how do you get in there with a long-barrel shotgun and an M16? And, of course, there's no indication that he walked in with the M16.
We're talking to Joel Skousen on the Black Tower Show. There does seem to be a common thread there, too, when you're talking about these people that are mentally ill. They're on these pharmaceuticals. They're very easily manipulated and put into these situations. You wonder what is really, really going on here. Is this part of a organized attempt to create hysteria in order to take away people's guns? Do you see it in that way, Mr. Joel Skousen on the Black Tower Show?
Yes, absolutely, I do. The professional lobby, and I will say it's professional, the Newtown, anti-gun people are out in force, claiming to Congress, now we've got to have a gun control. Senator anti-gun Feinstein comes out and says, if I had the votes, I would have taken all the guns and rounded them up last time around, but I didn't have the votes. After the Colorado successful recall of two of the leaders of the anti-gun vote there in Colorado going down and losing their jobs, it's even less likely that Congress will take up any major gun control. In fact, rightfully so, the emphasis in the press now is on the issue of how did this guy get a security clearance, and there are no good answers to that.
We're talking to Joel Skousen on the Black Tower Show.
Well, it's interesting that someone who, eyewitnesses described, he was wearing, the second shooter is what I'm talking about, he was wearing a, olive outfit, he was a white male, a tall white male, and, he walks into a naval installation, kills 12 people, no one can find him. It's amazing to me that they can just dismiss this second shooter like nothing happened when there was multiple eyewitnesses that says otherwise. So I mean, if they can keep getting away with things like this, where people don't even pay attention, I mean, how far away is their ability to be able to take our guns?
Well, we look at the Sandy Hook shooting, for example. They obviously had to falsify the fact that they had 3 other people in custody that they took away, and then they made them all disappear and made them all go away. Police personnel in the Sandy Hook area were very much disturbed by the cover-up that was going on, and that's why, as I covered in the World Affairs Brief, there was a major payoff from the Department of Justice. Not only did Eric Holder show up to give a private, closed briefing to all the police people, and I believe he was reinforcing the fact there's certain things going on here that have to do with national security, and you're all to shut up about it, and there will be severe threats if you don't. And then comes this $2.5 million payoff to the various police departments there, supposedly for expenses at the one-day Sandy Hook, shooting controversy. So, there's a payoff involved there. This sheriff, for example, who completely now wipes the slate clean after 24 hours, that there couldn't be possibly anybody but a single shooter, it really smells bad.
Talking to Joel Skousen on the Black Tower Show. Let's switch gears. I want to talk about Syria, U.S.'s involvement in Syria. Now it stands that we offered this ultimatum, we can take these chemical weapons from Assad, and that seems to be fine. I like what you're writing on the World Affairs Brief about Kerry's verbal gaffe that he made. He says, well, if this could happen, well, then we would do that. And, of course, now they switch it over. It's Obama's idea to have this democratic solution to Syria. Talk about what you think is happening here as opposed to what the American public is being fed.
Well, there was clearly a globalist agenda to take down Syria before they attack Iran. And the purpose of that was to reduce Israel's exposure to Syria's considerable arsenal of weapons of mass destruction, including, about 1,000 rockets that they possess, and not all of them, of course, having chemical weapons aboard. But still, it was a major retaliatory threat to Israel. It's much closer to Israel should Israel have attacked Iran preemptively, which they were planning on doing. So they delayed that agenda in order to take Syria down. That's why the U.S. Was funding surreptitiously and then openly the Syrian opposition filled with a lot of jihadists. I mean, it was clear on its face that there was no intention to have a democratic change in Syria because the Syrian opposition is factional as terribly. And there would be a bloodbath in Syria should they take over and do their ethnic cleansing, as they would certainly do. But this juggernaut towards war was completely derailed when Kerry went off script, and the White House clearly was upset when he made this offhand offer in response to reporters' question, well, is there anything that Syria could do to avoid this strike? Yeah, they could give up all their chemical weapons, but that isn't going to happen. It's obvious that it wasn't a serious offer. He was just throwing it out there as an answer to a question, and most of his interview was rambling off the cuff. It was not well thought up. Russia took advantage of it right away and got Assad to accept, and the U.S. was stuck. Here's a major U.S. official, Secretary of State, offering something offhandedly. Russia accepts, and they were stuck with it. And there was
those
hell
Skull
to
and
pay.
Bones guys. Those Skull and Bones guys weren't too happy with that when he made that statement.
No, not at all, because it really got in the way of their agenda. Now, I prognosticated in my World Affairs brief that what they would scramble to do now is try to make the conditions so onerous is part of the agreement, additional agreements, inspections and things, that Assad wouldn't be able to accept. That did not happen. It may still happen in the future. They could still put additional conditions upon this as they go through. But that didn't happen in the initial agreement signed this week in Geneva by Secretary Kerry and Russia. So what's interesting is that now all of a sudden the administration is pouring on the coals about Iran. They're bringing Netanyahu here at the end of the month to discuss Iran. It looks as if they've neutralized Syria to the extent that with inspectors in there controlling their weapons and things, they feel like that they can maybe attack Iran without getting any retaliation from Syria. But it looks like they're going to go for Iran now in order to continue this globalist agenda, which is to eventually take down Iran and Syria and Hezbollah and lock up the Middle East in these yes-men type countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which are funneling arms to various terrorist organizations, keeping up the war on terror and doing the bidding of the U.S. in terms of black operations.
Talking to Joel Skousen on the Black Tower Show, and meanwhile you do, right? On the World Affairs Brief, you talk a little bit about Russia's at the same time building up their nuclear weapons. And so what do you see? How do you see Russia playing in this? This is a real threat. Now all of a sudden, like Jake just mentioned to me, Time magazine.
Yeah.
How in every other country in the world, the cover of Time magazine was Putin, and then in America, what was on the cover in America? Well,
should college athletes be paid?
So is Putin like the voice of reason? I don't really know. How should the U.S. feel about Russia? And I mean, what is going on here? Is this like smoke and mirrors, or are we heading into I mean, we should be fearing their potential to destroy, and are we heading into a world war here? When is this going to happen, or will it happen?
Well, it's a very complex question. It has many facets to it, but let me just first of all address it relative to the Syrian situation. Russia is not, in my opinion, going to go to the wall over Syria. They would have been willing to let Syria fall. The proof of that is that they didn't send in any military might sufficient to stop the U.S. intervention in Syria. They did not deliver all of the S-300 weapons or anti-missile systems capable of taking down Israeli and U.S. aircraft. They didn't put any naval assets in the Mediterranean that were capable of interdicting Tomahawk missiles going in. And all they would have had to do to really stop U.S. intervention was move in 2 top-of-the-line fighter squadrons into Syrian air bases, and that would have been the end of it. The U.S. and Israel, neither one would challenge Syria had the Russians intervened directly like that with show of force. And they did not do that, which shows that, and all of this posturing by Putin is in fact aimed at showing Putin as the voice of reason and the U.S. as the bully of the world. Because this projects their long-term goal, which is, and the U.S., actually our globalists are in favor of projecting the same reputation anyway. They're trying to engineer a third world war, which is what, in the globalist agenda, so they can drive Americans in giving up sovereignty, acceding to a militarized global government that will exclude Russia and China, who are going to start World War III with a preemptive strike on America. Well, it actually, I think, will trigger around North Korea. North Korea is obviously being preserved as a trigger event. I mean, why else would they be targeting Iran, who is nowhere near as dangerous, doesn't have a bona fide nuclear weapon yet? They're going to target Iran, and yet North Korea has them. They're testing them. They have the missiles to deliver them. And we say no regime change is demanded, and the military option is not on the table. Why would we give North Korea a pass, the most tyrannical regime in the world, if it were not for the fact that the globalists see it as the puppet state of China that's going to be used to start World War III? That's part of the globalist agenda, to drive the new rationale for the global government and to prosecute World War III. So I see North Korea being preserved as a trigger event, Iran and Syria being a major regional war that will completely alienate the rest of the Muslim world against the United States and Israel, but is not intended to start World War III, mainly because Russia and China aren't ready. I mean, obviously, if Russia wanted to use the Syrian thing to provoke it, they could, but they're not. And Lavrov, the foreign minister, said blatantly, we're not going to war with anybody. And I believe it. He is, in fact. They're not ready. They need a blue water navy yet, so does China. But they are interested in exacerbating and promoting and helping the U.S. promote their reputation as the intervener, the bully of the world, and we are doing that in spades.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Joel Skousen on the Black Tower Show.
You say China is a puppet state for the globalists.
No, I did not say that. I said
okay.
North Korea is a puppet state of China. I do not believe the globalists control either Russia or China, despite the fact that it looks that way to some conservatives who really haven't analyzed it correctly. In other words, yes, they give them nuclear weapons. Yes, the globalists brought Mao Zedong to power in China. Yes, they brought Castro to power in Cuba and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. But not because these are communists or not because they control the communists. They basically are three separate predator centers, China, Russia, and the Anglo-American globalists. And the globalists are trying to help them, build them as enemies, so that they can create an atmosphere of conflict within the world sufficient to drive the Western states into a global government where they'll lose their freedom. I know it's Machiavellian, it's evil in the extreme, and it's beyond a lot of people's ability to comprehend, but I think it's just that sophisticated.
So this is like essentially a battle of competing new world orders, essentially.
Yes, in fact, Russia wants to control its version of the New World Order, and China intends to control its version of the New World Order. But that's a very real difference than one group basically got their handle on everything. And even though that one group, the Anglo-American globalist, is really running the world right now, nevertheless, there's a lot of hatred building against the U.S. that is beginning to align with Russia and China, and we're going to see increased polarization in the world between the pro-U.S. forces, the lackeys who just say yes, like France, Germany, Italy, all those countries, and those that are increasingly polarized against this global hegemon, the U.S. and its lackeys in Britain.
Are we not conducting our business in a way that adheres and respects people's personal liberty anymore?
Well, first of all, internally to the United States, the appearance of adherence to the Constitution, either by the courts or the government, is merely paper thin. It's only done when it's convenient and when it doesn't make a difference to the globalist agenda. Every time they want to move forward the agenda as it is in diminishing civil liberties, the right to a speedy trial, indefinite detention, warrantless spying, they simply throw the Constitution out the window with as a stinky diaper. That's what they think of it. They only preserve, and they will continue to preserve, the right to free religious expression, or at least outside of public domain, so that it fools Christians into believing that they're still free. Christians are fools in the sense that they believe as long as they go to church on Sunday and worship, that they have all the other freedoms. And they've been locking those down very, very systematically. But foreign policy-wise, it's just pure political theater. There's absolutely no defense of in foreign countries of individual liberties. The proof of that is that every time the government gets involved in a new nation forming a new constitution, they absolutely inhibit any Americans from participating in that process, trying to influence other nations to do a constitution like ours. I'm proof of that. As a political scientist, I worked in El Salvador and Guatemala during the revolution years when they were reforming a new constitution, and had the embassy spokesman say, you can help them with any constitution you want as long as it's socialist. We don't want any U.S.-style constitutions down here in Latin America. So the Project for Democracy and all this funds socialist and Marxist-type governments down there. I mean, these people are globalists. These people are trying to foment unrest. They're not out for democracy. It's merely a sham. I mean, people, if they weren't so subject to the horrendous propaganda of the mainstream media, they would know by now, as the rest of the world knows, that the United States is the one that gave chemical weapons to the rebels through Saudi Arabia, and I covered it in the World Affairs Brief. There have been Saudis, or not Saudis, but Syrians in the rebel camp who even admitted that they got chemical weapons from Saudi Arabia, and one of them exploded accidentally, and the other was put in a rocket and meant to, as a false flag operation to taint the Syrian government. As I pointed out in the briefs, Assad is no fool. There is no way, knowing that the United States was just itching for an excuse to intervene over chemical weapons, he would ever have authorized them, or that any military loyal to Assad would have ever dared use them. Now, they could have bought someone off, for example, to try to use them, but I think more likely, since this has happened before, some 3 months earlier, that the rebels were given through Saudi Arabia chemical weapons, homemade-type, rocket-type weapons, to be able to finger the Syrian regime and blame it on them. And Americans who have this moral outrage about these things simply are ignoramuses who believe the mainstream press.
Talking to Joel Skousen on the Black Tower Show.
We just witnessed a rare moment in which someone was such a corrupt, vile individual that it prevented them from getting a promotion or getting a job, even in Washington, D.C., with Larry Summers, stepping away from the Fed chairmanship possibility. Timothy Geithner passed on it as well. This woman, Janet Yellen, is being touted as the front runner by the Wall Street Journal. She's the current vice Fed chairman. Does it matter who's at the controls right now, or is the Fed going to continue to just print money and this business as usual?
Well, this is the key towards keeping the world together economically until war comes. And I've been very clear about this in the World Affairs Brief. There is not going to be an economic collapse, as all kinds of people with hype on the Internet have been predicting. Indeed, Peter Schiff, as much as I respect his opinion, says, well, it just can't keep going. It's got to be ending in hyperinflation, and it doesn't have to end in hyperinflation. Eventually it does, but they totally underestimate how long the powers that be can draw this out. If the powers that be, and they show every indication they're intending to do this, continue to keep inflation at its current rate, which is the real rate, is 6 to 9%. We've been at that rate for 20 years. It's still survivable. Sure, it's hard on those with fixed income, but because of the government welfare system that there is, people do adapt. People do slowly adapt to those kinds of prices. They can keep this running, I believe, for at least 10 years longer. And they intend to do so, I believe, because they want this Third World War, which is probably at least 8 to 10 years away before Russia and China are ready, They want that war to give them cover. Then when a nuclear strike comes on them, and they walk away scot-free. It wasn't our fault that the economy went down. It's the war's fault. And they're still in the leadership shoes. They come out of their bunkers and they talk us into a new world order. Larry Summers is the consummate globalist. He was part of Harvard University. The scandal when the phony fall of the Soviet Union went down, we were complicit in that, in the sense that we helped cover for that without revealing how insanely obvious it was that it was a fake collapse. But we didn't say anything. We covered for it. Harvard University got the contract. Now, here's a Marxist university, economically speaking, gets the contract to go in and for millions of dollars from the U.S. government to teach the Russians how to do their free market economy. And they sabotaged it. And they sabotaged it on purpose so that the Russian people would then hate free markets. And they shipped over pallet loads of $100 bills to the oligarchs and the wealthy of Russia, so that they plastered them all over Europe. And all they had was $100 bills. They had no 20s. They had no $50 bills. They had no 10s, only $100 bills. That's why they were giving tips. It was all from American coffers. That was no free market change that went on there. Larry Summers was part of that corruption of Harvard University. He's a dyed-in-the-wool globalist. He was started out in the Republican Party under Reagan, and then he switched over to become Treasury Secretary under Clinton. And that was a telling point that he was a globalist. They can switch parties. They had people naming the Republicans as well as the Democrats. But there was a lot of opposition to Summers because of him appearing to have betrayed the Republicans. And it looks as if they really weren't going to get his name past the Senate. There was a lot of left in the Senate that hates Larry Summers. And so they're going to go with a technocrat. Yellen is a pure technocrat, a yes girl. She has never stood out other than to say exactly yes to what Bernanke wants. So in my estimation, the powers that be at the Fed will simply be able to dictate to them exactly what they want. She's not a high-up insider, but she's a technocrat, and she'll do the job for them.
Yeah,
business as usual, though.
Yeah, we've had Greg Palast on the show, and he told us some interesting stories about Larry Summers and the World Trade Organization and wanting to, spread.
Yes, I'm familiar with, but you've got to remember, Greg Palast comes from the far left. He sees Summers as part of the corrupt capitalist view. He does not understand the globalist conspiracy. And it's more than just crony capitalism. Yes, crony capitalism is involved because that's how the globalists pursue people of money and draw them in, is with government, corporate relationships and favoritism contracts. There is that corruption. But it's not the engine of it. It's not just greed. It's not just wealth. It is a globalist conspiracy of power, which people on the left don't quite see yet.
Go a little more into that, 'cause I think it's starting to come into focus for me. When you talk about globalism as driven by power, as opposed to, you were critiquing Palast, who says that he only goes a certain distance with it. It's just crony capitalism, and it ends there. You're talking about a more systematic, overarching collection of individuals who are preserving and growing power for themselves?
That's right. And you see, there has to be some explanation of the fact that these are already the most wealthy people of the world. And they already have power within their own governments, but it's not enough. Can they use any more yachts? Can they use any more luxury retreats? Can they use any more wine, women, and song, any more money? No, they can't possibly use more than what they have. The only thing left to be gained is a comprehensive global system of control whereby they destroy once and for all this vestige of national sovereignty, which is embedded in the history, in the consciousness of Americans. And that's why they keep building enemies. I mean, they gave Russia the first nuclear weapons material. They gave them the rest of the nuclear plans that they couldn't steal from the Manhattan Project. They brought Mao Zedong to power. They brought many communist governments to power. They brought many fundamentalist Muslims to power to create this war on terror. And what I'm saying is that all of this points to the fact that they're building for more and more war. The mother of all terrorism will be this nuclear strike in America, and it's proof that they're involved in it, not in terms of directing it necessarily, but involved. They continue to cover for the Russians. Think about this. They give an annual report to the Congress on the state of the military problem in China, and they always downplay it at the end. They always end that report with announcing more military maneuvers with China, more kowtowing to China. But there's no report on Russia, which is further ahead in weapons of mass destruction, in building new multi-independent targeted warheaded missiles every year, the Topol M series and their maneuvering warheads, all of that. Their underground bunker systems, all of these war things that they're building, and we're talking more disarmament, even while they have reneged on every single treaty and backed out of every single disarmament agreement that we've had, and violated them, such as the intermediate nuclear forces. But there's no report on Russia. I mean, that tells me that the globalists are covering for these war preparations, downplaying them, so that Americans, and you ask Americans, who's worried about Russia and China? Oh, no, nobody. It's the war on terror. I'm saying that's a diversion. That's going to be kept foremost in the minds of people until the surprise war comes. And that's what's going to shock everyone, is our government simply never prepared for.
Meanwhile,
I can tell you, people in the Pentagon are prepared. Pentagon people know that it's coming, but they have been told, you don't mention anything about Russia and China.
And it seems, meanwhile, the average folk were just kind of along for the ride. I mean, these are powerful men playing war games with each other.
Yeah. Well, but as I say, ultimately, this has been going on for generations. It's incapable that any single individual could keep this globalist agenda of building communist enemies and creating terror and all of this. One man just can't do this and pass it on and keep passing it on.
Sure.
This is a systematic type of evil that we're dealing with, and it's very much a philosophy and agenda, and it's been going on since World War I with the projection to try to get a League of Nations out of that war. World War II gave us the United Nations, but it had no power, no taxing power, no military power. You mark my words. When this Third World War comes along, which they're heading us into, they'll come out of the bunkers and demand this is a now world League of Democracy that excludes the communists. We can have peace now after we prosecute this war, and we'll give it military power because, you see, our United States military will be decapitated in this preemptive strike. Our government will be responsible. You talk about an insider job, to not use our weapons to defend, to not interdict those missiles, and they will not interdict. They'll let the first strike fall. So that if our military is decapitated, then they have the excuse to say our only choice now is to build a militarized world government to prosecute this war. And this is diabolical in its scope.
Oh, God, that sounds horrible. Is that in our future? That sounds very bleak, Mr. Skousen.
Yeah. How do we even explain PDD 60 under Clinton, 1997? Presidential Decision Directive 60 instructing our military nuclear forces to absorb and be prepared to retaliate after absorbing a nuclear first strike. They've even warned our missile forces that they're not going to get permission to launch on one.
Well, you deal with strategic relocation in case there is some kind of attack. But how do you survive living under whatever a globalist, post-nuclear world? That's horrible, man. But let's go a little bit.
It is.
Yeah, I can't imagine. But go into a little bit of strategic relocation. We're here in upstate New York. What are some of the guidelines? What are some of the things that people can look for, at least kind of maybe prepare themselves in case there was an attack? could you give people just maybe a few little tips? Obviously, go pick up the book, Strategic Relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places, but go a little bit, and also tell, how'd you get in? I mean, how did this begin with you, and this interest in finding safe places?
Well, I actually foresaw what was happening after I read my uncle's book called The Naked Communist, clear back when I was 17 as a teenager. When I saw the documentary evidence in the late 50s on what happened in World War II and bringing China and Russia to power and all of these other, and realized it wasn't communists that were protecting the communists in government, it was people, and they were Americans, just normal Americans, or what appeared to be normal Americans. I thought to myself, this isn't going to turn out very well. And someday, I think, this nation is going to take a beating because of these people who are trying to sabotage our liberty. And so I designed my first high-security residence when I was a teenager, 17. So even though I then became trained in constitutional law as well as architecture and started this dual career of warning people about what was happening to see if we could stop it, I, at the same time, was one of the pioneers in the field of high-security retreats and construction because I felt like we were going to need it. And so far, my premonitions have come true. We are going to need it, and it's coming. And so I eventually, and just prior to Y2K, I wrote the book Strategic Relocation just because there was a tremendous amount of motivation of people just head for the hills to get rid of the danger of Y2K. And I said, no, wait a minute, you've got to be very careful because if you outstrip your financial resources, go out to, Hodunksville, and Y2K doesn't become the end-all, as Gary North thought it was going to be, then you're stuck out there. You can't make a living. And sure enough, hundreds of people had to move back to the city afterwards and do this properly and, establish a secondary home as a retreat or something, but not cut your financial lifeline. And that's where we still are today, even though I strongly believe that in a decade or so, in 2020, sometime we're going to have a third world nuclear war where we're going to be the target. The major threat that people face is these huge population densities in the East Coast, especially the New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia corridor. I mean, you've got over 1,000 people per square mile in there, and when they start to fan out because of lack of food, lack of electricity, they're even going to get into upstate New York. Now, that's a lot safer than being close to those areas. But you can prepare, and one of the reasons why I put out my books is to help people understand the strategy of concealment and hiding rather than confrontation. In other words, while I believe in being armed for the last-ditch defense that you have to do sometimes, I don't believe in confronting large groups of people who are just starving. They're not evil, they're just panicky and hungry, and they're going to be scavenging. And so it's really wise to be able to have a home that's got basement space where you can do concealed sheltering, concealed storage, concealed safe rooms within a home, so that if waves of people start coming down your street, you can just open the doors, don't lock them up, but get down in the safe room where most of your storage and safe goods are and let people pass through, rummage through, and just move on and avoid that confrontation. I do believe it's wise people have retreats if they can afford, even going together in joint things, having a cabin together someplace where they can store some things and get out of the cities when you need to, and then come back to the city when things kind of knit back together. So my philosophy is one of contingencies rather than everybody move out to a rural country where you can't survive financially. Stay where your jobs are. I give advice on how to move within the periphery of those urban areas so that you're not trapped within high-density areas and corridors. It's somewhat complex. That's why the book is out there. It's got a tremendous amount of information and things. But generally, there is a solution for everybody, even those that can't move.
Joel Skousen on the Black Tower Show, Wise Words. Pick up the book, Strategic Relocation. Well, I hope it doesn't get to that point. I hope it doesn't get to that point where there's just...
Well, and I hope it doesn't either, but if it does, it's better to be forewarned and prepared than it is to say, oh, he was right, but there's nothing I can do.
Yeah. Well, the amount of money I make, hope. is about all I can afford right now. People are hurting out there. Rochester, we were just talking about Rochester, New York, 11th poorest city in the United States, and I see it. You know, obviously I love my city. I love Rochester, but when you talk about waves of starving people, I don't know, drive down Parcells Avenue in Rochester. The wave has already begun, and people are starving and they're hurting out there. So,
but it's nothing compared to what will come when even your well-heeled can't go to the grocery store and buy anything, and no one is prepared to grow or to get water if there's no water coming out of the spigot. I mean, let's face it. People have learned to become too interdependent and not self-sufficient enough, and it's going to be extremely dangerous someday just to be in any urban or suburban area where waves of people are coming out of the cities pillaging. It's just, you don't want to be in the way. People are going to take to the roads, and it's going to be no better out on the roads.
Especially, I mean, it does seem like the generation, these younger kids now, I mean, me, definitely. Raised on TV. To some degree, my whole life is propped up, subsidized. I don't even, I can't make a fire. I want to be able to hunt or trap or, I don't know, have a garden or grow some food. You realize, if you really sit down and think about it, how ill-prepared most people are in this country. It's pretty fascinating, and so I think it's important for people to realize that. So thanks for bringing that up, Mr. Joe Skousen. I want to thank you.
Well, the good news is that you've got time. There's time to learn. There's time to get prepared. This is not a doomsday scenario of next week or this year even. There's going to be time. So let's make use of it and get prepared.
Joe Skousen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We'd love to have you back on the show, and thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Good day.